Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, which is India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Roger Highfield, who is an author, ex-science editor of the Daily Telegraph and editor of New Scientist. Currently, he is the science director of the Science Museum Group, fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, a visiting professor of public engagement at the Dunn School, University of Oxford, and Department of Chemistry, UCL, and a member of the UKRI Medical Research Council. So, Roger, really appreciate and truly honored to have you on the show. So,
pleasure to be with you, Ed.
So, the evolution science, how is the exponential tech stack you think is accelerating or helping the science industry?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of things going on at the same time. For example, if you think about developing a new product, many years ago, you might make a prototype in a workshop. Well, now with things like 3D printing, you can print very quickly, components in plastics or metals or whatever to try them out. I remember talking to an F1 motorsports team, years ago, who were used to rapidly trying out new components for F1 engines that they could just print out in their workshop. But in fact, today you can go even further than that. Because of the massive rise in computer power, we can make digital twins of motors. In fact, there are digital twins of the whole planet. And I've been working with the team at UCL about making digital twins of the human body. And, this opens up all sorts of new possibilities. We're familiar with them when it comes to climate change, in the sense that, in effect, digital twins of the Earth have helped us understand the urgency of trying to curb carbon emissions. But they're beginning to use it in medicine now as well. And there's new kinds of computer power around the corner. Everyone's familiar with the rise of AI, but there's also quantum computing is likely to make an impact in the next decade or so. And in fact, there's also the return of analog computing, the oldest form of computing, computers that are using light to do calculations, and they offer distinct advantages over today's digital computers. So basically, Eddie, to put it in a nutshell, there's a lot going on and it's all feeding off each other.
Completely. Yes, there's so many things going on in the space of technology. You mentioned about 3D printing, and you also mentioned about digital twins. I guess that's exploding. And Omniverse, NVIDIA, has this division called Omniverse, which has built a digital twin of the entire Earth for climate, and solving the climate problem. And so, yes, there's some exciting things happening in the space of technology. And like you rightfully pointed out, I think there's a convergence of sorts. Earlier you used to say that there is this artificial intelligence or this virtual reality or this Earth-specific technology which is creating Earth-specific applications. But I guess the convergence of these tech stack, the applications that might come out is unimaginable, unfathomable at this point in time. So I think almost everyone, right from organizations to nations, businesses, individuals, should keep in touch and constantly keep on upgrading or learning, being a lifelong learner on what's happening in the space of technology, because I guess the ones who are lifelong learner will be able to build a preferred future. Now, we are tinkering around with the source code of life itself, and there is something called as CRISPR-Cas9, So how do you think CRISPR-Cas9 or biotechnology is transforming mankind? And we'll really appreciate if you could share some examples of the pros and the cons of CRISPR-Cas9.
Well, I think you've got to put it in a big context. So, genetic modification of life was sort of born in the 70s. And actually, there was a moratorium then because people were worried about the implications of where it would take us. And when you look at old genetic modification technologies, you were just sort of dropping genes that you wanted into the genetic code of an organism. So, for example, in the Science Museum, we've got Tracy the sheep, and she was developed in what's called farming. That's with a pH. And she made a alpha antitrypsin, a drug in her milk. But it took a lot of, because they were sort of randomly dropping this gene construct into the genetic code of sheep embryos. You know, I can't remember how many sheep embryos they modify, but I suspect it was hundreds, if not thousands, to get Tracy the sheep. So that was back in the 90s. And I can also remember the very first attempt to treat an immune disorder in people, which was in 1990. It was ADA deficiency. So the idea was that if you could put in a gene to make the missing factor, that you could fix the immune system of a child that had what was called bubble baby syndrome, where they were very vulnerable to any infection. And actually what's happened over the 90s, gene therapy just didn't really work very well. Then it started going wrong. We had some people dying as a result of gene therapy. And you look at it today, and we have got a small number of gene therapies which actually work really well for certain things. Unbelievably to me, still, there's things like blindness. There are forms of blindness that you can treat with gene therapy. You mentioned CRISPR. This is a much more precise way of altering genetic code, and there's huge excitement about the potential of doing that. And in fact, there are other technologies. I mean, this is modifying a kind of bacterial system, but there's something called zinc fingers as well, which were found by Aaron Klug in the UK back in the 90s. And that's another precise way to fiddle with genes, which is being used. And I think that it's got huge potential for, particularly for diseases where we really understand the genetics of what's going wrong. So things like hemophilia, forms of hemophilia, where you've got a blood clotting disorder, you rely on a cascade of proteins to clot your blood, and it could be a genetic spelling mistake. Just one genetic letter that's wrong in one of those proteins can ruin the whole process. And this is where these technologies can have a huge impact. The more tricky thing is that the kind of guilty secret of genetics is that even though we unveiled the first human genetic codes, the human genome, as we call it, the whole recipe to build a human being back in 2000, in June 2000, with you know, Francis Collins and others, and Craig Venter and so on, we're still actually in a bit of the dark age in terms of understanding the genetic code. So when you think of one of those awful eugenicist dreams about let's make smarter people, so many genes are involved with intelligence. And in fact, you can't even define intelligence actually in a very easy way. It's a total mess. So I think that we are in a new exciting era for really well understood genetic diseases. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, because there's still worries with CRISPR with what are called off-target effects, where you think you've made a precise change in one bit of the genetic code, but in fact you're causing disruption elsewhere. But I still think it's got huge potential. But it's quite shocking how little we understand about the overall genetic code. In fact, a colleague of mine at the Dunn School, Matthew Freeman, has done a study of what he calls the unknown, or he's talking about unknomics. And he's done a comparison of genetic codes of different creatures and the ones that we understand, you know, genes that we understand in things like nematodes and fruit flies and so on. And he reckons there's about a fifth of the human genetic code that's important that we really don't understand at all well. So the idea that now we've got the technology to design, you know, people and modify them anyway, I think we've got to be realistic. And also there's huge ethical issues as well. I mean, I could go on about this all day long, Eddie, but that in a nutshell is where I am on this.
There is so little we understand of our universe, the planet that we live in, and even our body, though there is some great minds, I think, asking really brave out there questions and probing what we termed impossible. Yes, I mean, we're very, very far away, and the moral and ethical implications of tinkering with genomes is another conversation itself. But I think the only thing which makes this blue dot in this expanse of darkness is this 3 pound, brain and humans, which we forever keep on asking questions. Yes, there'll be, there'll be those people who'll always say, okay, that's too far ahead, that's too way ahead, and that's too stupid, and you shouldn't go there. But I think we humans, that's the way we are created. We keep on asking questions, and there is a need for asking brave and sometimes maybe even stupid questions, because I think those questions can lead to answers which could be extremely profound to mankind. And I think we're living in such an exciting space, there where everything is converging, even the entire globe. I guess, who would have thought that me sitting in India, in a place called Goa, would have an opportunity to have a conversation with you, who's at the forefront of the cutting edge of science. But I guess internet allows you to do that. It's breaking the barrier, and with possibly the metaverse, Web 3.0, and that could be, we could be possibly sitting face to face with maybe holographic this characters through the virtual reality or mixed reality glasses. So yes, talking about genomics, besides the biotech, there is something called a synthetic biology, where there are scientists who are kind of engineering new life forms. You said there is obviously, would you like to kind of address it? Because, there are people who are working on xenobots, and then there are people who are also working on simulated intelligence, general intelligence. How do you view these new life forms impacting our world?
Well, I should say, just to step back for a moment, we've just at the Science Museum opened up an immersive experience called Science Fiction. It's a site where we show the interplay between science and science fiction. And, it's actually, there's a lot in common. I mean, we've talked about climate models predicting what would happen to the planet, say, in 2050 if we don't curb carbon emissions, and it's pretty terrifying, I have to say. But equally, we've got a long history of science fiction thinking about what happens if climate got out of control, what happens, if we can modify people, if we seek genetic perfection, what happens if artificial intelligence gets smarter than we do. And so, in a funny sort of way, that there's a correspondence there with attempts to use digital twins and other forms of modelling to understand where this great adventure called science is taking us. So I think science fiction actually, strangely enough, has quite an important role in helping society understand where technology developments are taking us. Now, when it comes to synthetic life, I mean, there's a lot of different components to this, and I can remember research on what was called artificial life, where you had self-replicating organisms in a computer back in the people like Thomas Ray back in the 90s. But I think I'm a bit more skeptical about the ability of digital to really reproduce the way that we do, because in fact, funnily enough, is research that a colleague of mine has done at UCL, Peter Coveney. You've got to realize that computers are digital and they use single precision floating point numbers. And, there's something like 4 billion of these numbers. And I don't think you can recapitulate the richness of reality that we experience, our analog reality, with so few numbers. And in fact, there's more serious problems. So with chaos theory, which is sort of discovered already, the first insights came from Ed Lorenz, who was, strangely enough, in the 60s at MIT. He was trying to simulate a simple model of the convection in the Earth's atmosphere, and he thought he'd fed the same numbers into a simulation, and he got completely different answers out. And he found that a tiny rounding of his numbers led to quite different results, and this led to the butterfly effect and so on. So I suppose what I'm getting to in a very long-winded way is I'm skeptical that you can do things like download your brain into a digital computer, because the environment in a digital computer is just not rich enough and can't deal with that non-linearity. But there are other amazing things happening. So people are interested in this phenomenon of emergence, and they're finding that if you take lots of simple cells and put them together, you find that developmental programming kicks in, and you can build simple organisms that can swim about and so on. And then there's also extraordinary work at the Laboratory for Molecular Biology by someone called Jason Chin. Jason has been looking at the fact that every protein in your body is built from the same set of amino acids. It's 20 amino acids. And he's saying, well, what about if we can design life based on different amino acids, unnatural amino acids? And he's begun to do that now. So you can come up with organisms that viruses can't reproduce in, because they've got a fundamentally different chemistry. So I think there's some very interesting things going on there, but I think they're still at a very early stage. I mean, another bit of research which is fascinating is organoids. We're beginning to grow mini brains and mini guts and so on in the lab. And people are talking about, well, what should we worry about a mini brain, mini human brain, and whether could it possibly get conscious? I'm pretty skeptical about that, but you probably can see some synchronized activities and some other interesting behaviors in that. These things are really interesting for understanding, like, the action of drugs on the body. But I think if I wind back to what we were saying about gene therapy, the fact that here we are in 2022, and we've got a handful of good gene therapies, and we started trying it out on people in 1990. I think for these technologies to really deliver, we're talking a multi-decadal timescale, really. But I think, there are some very interesting possibilities out there, definitely.
Right. You mentioned, that, these things take a long time to go from a lab to the market. But I hope that the time span kind of shortens, because things have changed. Earlier things were on a very linear pattern, but because of the growth of compute power and the growth of exponential technologies, I think the timelines are shrinking, because there's some, at least, massive growth in the space of artificial intelligence. Who would have thought that, DeepMind would come and solve the protein folding problem, but they have done that with Alpha-2. So what are your views on artificial intelligence? How do you think these AI is going to revolutionize healthcare? And we will appreciate if you can kind of give some examples also.
Yeah, well, it's just to make one comment about the acceleration of things. We've got an exhibition opening later this month called Injecting Hope, on the race to develop a COVID vaccine. And if you'd said to me in March 2020 we would have an RNA vaccine by the end of the year that was being injected in people, I would have said extremely unlikely. But you're right, we basically did lots of things in parallel that we would have done in serial before. They were very clever. The RNA technology worked. There'd been a massive amount of pre-investment in pandemic research and so on. So that got us there. AI I find really complicated and difficult to talk about, because I think people forget that the history of AI is littered with failure and false dawns, And in the museum, for example, we've got the Pilot ACE computer, which is the kind of physical manifestation of Alan Turing's Turing machine. And it was Turing who first started thinking about artificial intelligence. And some people call him the father of AI. In the 60s, we had what people jokingly call GoFi, good old-fashioned AI. And the faith was then that if you stuffed into a computer enough rules and circumstances, then it would just know everything about everything, and it would be super intelligent. But in fact, they were cumbersome and they never really worked out. Then we had the rise of neural networks, which are people say they're based on the human brain. Well, a bit like a smiley face is like the Mona Lisa, I guess they are, but they're pretty primitive. But people like Jeff Hinton in the late 90s found out a way to come up with a computer system which can learn from example. And that's where deep learning came from. And that's really, it's quite different from the good old-fashioned AI of the 60s. So this is one of the things I think is confusing. People use AI basically to mean really clever computery stuff, and they very rarely talk about what they're talking about. So you mentioned AlphaFold, and I think that is the most important bit of AI in science that I've ever seen, in that it's a classic problem. We know that the genetic code spells out the amino acids in a protein like sort of beads on a string, but how that protein folds up into a shape is absolutely central to how it works in the body. And once you understand that, you can think about designing drugs to interfere with it and all sorts of things. But there is a slight catch with what AlphaFold has done, which is, although they've now deduced the structure of, I think, every known protein, there are elements of proteins that they're not so good at. And when you talk about the structure, it's actually technically they're trying to reproduce the crystal structure. So the classic way to get the structure of protein is that you purify the protein and then you make a crystal of it, which can be incredibly difficult. And then you analyze it with X-rays using a technique called X-ray diffraction. Or in fact, today you can use something called cryo-EM. Anyway, it's a big old palaver. But the problem is that AlphaFold's giving you the crystal structures, and actually the shape of a protein in your body in a warm, wet environment is sort of malleable and different. So although I think it is a really important advance, it's important not to exaggerate its significance. Also, some poor scientists have got to check that they've actually got their sums right and so on, which is, it's going to be a heck of a lot harder to do that than to generate all the structures. And I think there's a flaw at the heart of AI, which people don't appreciate, which is that you're training your AI on known data. And so the smartness of your AI is limited by how good your data is. And if you don't use the right data to train your AI, you can get complete rubbish out of an AI. And we've seen that, with machine learning trained to recognize faces. And it worked great on white Caucasian faces that it was trained on, but it was hopeless on any people of color and so on. And I think for me, a useful distinction is narrow AI, in that I think we're in the era of narrow AI. And by that, I mean AI is superhuman, but in a really specific job, so if it's like playing chess or the protein folding problem, it can easily beat humans. But if you look at what we do in a regular day, like, just making yourself a cup of tea, if you try to train an AI to do that, but not just in your kitchen, but in any kitchen, or in a plane or something, that's actually technically a very difficult problem. So I think people love talking about the successes of AI, but they don't talk about the failures. So to give you one good example of the failures, during the COVID epidemic, there was a lot of effort to train AIs to look at lung scans to diagnose COVID and so on. And they really didn't work very well. And one of the problems is that if you're training an AI, if you've got 20 different hospitals using 20, I'm exaggerating, but 20 slightly different X-ray machines calibrated in a slightly different way, then your training set is already messy. So all I'm saying in a very long-winded way is I think AI is really important. It's having a big impact, but very narrow. And it's still actually not really well understood how you design a perfect neural net to do a job. There's a bit of, fiddling around and suck it and see and so on to get these things to work brilliantly. Obviously, Demis Hassabis and people at DeepMind are brilliant at doing this. When you talk about general AI, which is what we've got between our ears, I think we're a long way away from general AI at the moment. And, I mean, I'd love to be surprised, but if ever you want a bit of a laugh, I mean, I know this is not really quite AI, but look at the humanoid robotics challenges. Watching a humanoid robot presented with a nut that it's got to unscrew for the first time using a tool it hasn't encountered before. They're really quite a long way from the Terminator of those movies that have enthralled us over the years.
Thank you for sharing those insights, and I guess it's so pertinent that we when we talk about AI, we also mention its downsides. I guess I mean most of the time we always kind of glorify and bring to the people's audience's attention the positives or the things, the applications is doing at the best. Like, but you mentioned that there's so many things which AI is still not got the basics, it can't do. And yes, you rightfully pointed out, I mean, the narrow AI can do a specific thing really, really well and possibly outperforms every single human being on the planet. But even if you wanted to go slightly broad, then we are failing miserably. And I think we have, like you rightfully pointed out, to build an artificial, generally intelligent machines, we are pretty much far away. But what scares me is that even in the narrow space, what AI can do is something I think we should take cognizant about, because even if it's in this narrow space, for example, there's something called a stable diffusion, which does text to image generation pretty good, and it scares me what it might do in the decade, when the technology stack matures. What would it do to designers or artists who made a living making designs? So those are things I think we need to start having conversations today before these tech stack goes out of hand. Now the tech stack, talking about this tech stack, there are so many things. There's brain computer interface, there's quantum computing, which you spoke about, there's nanotechnology, and so many other things. If you had to point out the few tech stacks which you think is going to create the most benefit for society and the world in this decade, what would that be? And what are those technologies which really, really scare you?
The thing about technology is it's a double-edged sword. When humans learned how to harness fire billions of years ago, they could keep warm, they could cook their food, but they could also burn their neighbors' fields down, they could burn down their huts or whatever. So I think with any powerful technology, it's got the ability to do great things, and it's got ability to do terrible things as well. So we talked about genetic modification. I think there's huge implications for human health there, and it's amazing that we can talk about treating diseases like hemophilia and so on permanently. Equally, we're now beginning to look at genetically modified insects to deal with things, and I think there's always been an unease about releasing GMOs into the environment. Of course, we have to put it in its proper context, because the environmentalists like to portray it that as if genetic modification is entirely novel, but of course nature's evolving and coming up with its own GMOs. Every time you get a cold, you've got a virus genetically modifying cells in your nose to make more viruses. So we've got to put it in the proper context. But I can see why some people are a bit queasy about those applications. I think in computation, although we still feel like a long way from there, I think quantum computing could lead to interesting new things, particularly for simulating proteins and drugs and things like that, where we've been talking about computer-aided drug design for decades. It's proved much more challenging to do it properly than we realize. So I think that will have a big effect. And we've mentioned digital twin technology. In fact, I've just been working on a book about this called Virtual You with Peter Coveney. And we think an important advance in AI will come, and we're beginning to see it, where I've talked about neural networks that you train on data, you can train them to recognize, to look at a face and say, this is a chihuahua and this is a cupcake. I mean, there's some funny examples on the web, but it doesn't understand what it's looking at. But there's another class of models, these are called physics-based models, which are the kind of things that are used in weather forecasting and simulations, where you're really trying to capture in mathematical form how the whole weather system works. And actually, I think that AI is going to advance when we get so-called big AI, which is a fusion between physics-based modeling and neural networks, where you get the best of both worlds. And we've looked at that for pandemic drug development and so on, and others are beginning to do this. So you're actually combining a computer model that understands, in inverted commas, how the world works, with a neural net model that doesn't really understand anything. You just train it on stuff and it sort of picks it up. And I think a fusion of those two is going to take us in new directions. And say, in terms of human health, let's wind back a bit. Digital twin technology, we're already seeing how important that is for understanding the global climate system and actually warning us about problems. We tend to think in a linear way, but for me, what's terrifying about the climate modeling is that several of them now predict tipping points in the climate. You get feedbacks in the climate which can stabilize it, but you also get feedbacks that can destabilize it. So within a decade or two, you could lose the Amazon, or within a decade or two, you could lose the permafrost in the Arctic and release more methane to accelerate climate change. So I think that's one very tangible example where we're getting some insights. And I think medicine's going to change profoundly when we get digital twins of people, because at the moment, contemporary medicine is a bit like driving down the road while looking in a wing mirror. You're always looking. If someone gives you a drug, it's because they know that drug's worked on people who are genetically a bit like you or your age or with your symptoms. But I think we're now approaching the era where with a digital twin, you can figure out this drug is designed to work just for you. And I think that's going to be transformative. So I think digital twins will make medicine predictive rather than the strange sort of unsatisfactory form of medicine that we've got at the moment. But that does depend on us having much more theory about how the body works and so on. We're still a bit of a way off from developing that. Although with hearts, for example, you'd be amazed what you can do in terms of digital twin hearts.
You're also the author of After Dolly, the uses and misuses of human cloning. Would you like to talk about the book briefly?
Well, I wrote the book with Ian Wilmot, who led this big team that cloned Dolly the sheep. And it was a huge story when Dolly became known to the world. I mean, it really made headlines around the world, and people got very carried away about the thought of, if you could take an adult cell from someone who had died, could you grow them again? And I think they kind of missed the fact that, well, you could in theory come up with a genetic copy of someone, but they'd have to live out their whole life to be the same age. So if you had some poor person who died at the age of 40 and you took a cell from them, went through the cloning process, you'd have to apart from the fact you've got to implant the embryo and you need a surrogate mother, and there's massive ethical issues there. You'd have to give them exactly the same environment as the person who died but it led to lots of crazy speculation about what was called reproductive cloning. But then there was another side of cloning which did cause a lot of excitement, which was what was called therapeutic cloning, where you could make an early embryo based on someone. Say, I could take one of your skin cells, grow an early embryo, dismantle it to take stem cells from that, and then I could grow any of your tissues and so on in the laboratory. But in, I think, 2006, Yamanaka in Japan came up with a much more elegant way to do it, where you This is to make what are called iPS cells, where you can take a skin cell and then you genetically modify it with a few factors, and that can make it embryonic again. And so we were really looking through all the implications of this technology. I hasten to add, reproductive cloning feels to me as unlikely today as it was then when it comes to people, although they have used it for sort of elite racing camels and goodness knows what else, and also for saving endangered species. The stem cell revolution has proved much more difficult than we thought, to reliably persuade these parent cells to grow into cells that you need, say, to treat Parkinson's disease or do other things. But sometimes you find the problem is the disease is caused by the body turning on itself. So even if you can make replacement cells, they're just going to be destroyed by the body. And there's still a lingering worry about, well, if the cells aren't quite right when you implant them, are they going to proliferate and turn into the wrong cell types or even become cancerous? But this technology is definitely, I think, in the long term, going to lead to some interesting possibilities to repair damage, and also for testing drugs and organoids and things like that. So again, I think the moral of the story is there's huge implications, but it takes much longer than we think to get these things to work properly.
Right. Yeah. So these things are very exciting as well as scary, and yes, the time horizons are much longer. You are the science director at the Science Museum Group. Would you like to talk about your role and how you're leveraging technologies to kind of engage the audience?
There's a lot of interest in digital, and clearly, we've got more and more online content, and in fact, we've been moving objects from a store that we've got in West London to another huge hangar we've got near Swindon in the UK, and we've been digitizing things. So, taking high quality photographs, producing digital records with them, which is a monumental task. Sometimes the digitization we do, we do some more exotic things. So, for example, we've got some iconic steam locomotives. We had the Flying Scotsman and the Mallard and Stephenson's rocket. And so we turned Stephenson's rocket into a point cloud, so you can sort of rotate it and look underneath it and so on. We've also played around with various kind of immersive technologies. So we've used virtual reality, of course, and we had a experience called Space Descent, where we reproduced the interior of a Soyuz spacecraft. In fact, we've got the spacecraft in the museum. And then in the VR, you had a narration from Tim Peake, who was the first official British astronaut, as he descended from the International Space Station back to Earth. And in the VR, we could show people what it felt like, to undock and then begin, to go back to Earth, with the plasma ball around the. Unfortunately, we didn't have force feedback, so you didn't get the very sharp thump when you touched down on the steps. But that was a lot of fun. And in fact, we're doing an immersive experience now of the Flying Scotsman, which is this, very iconic locomotive. And in our science fiction exhibition, we've worked with Framestore, who did the visual effects for Gravity, to do a bit of world building. So there's some simple tricks we use to persuade people that they've gone up to a spaceship. And then we've got an immersive environment in the middle with digital projectors, where we try to show an alien life form, which is sort of loosely based on swarming social creatures like bees and so on, but leaving light pheromone trails. So you get very interesting effects when you're in the immersive experience. So we played around with that sort of technology as well. But we find that digital, we're moving away from just having, we do have screens with people being interviewed and so on. but we find that more analog interactions are more satisfying. So we've got these kids analog experiments called the Wonder Labs with stroboscopes and Tesla coils and friction slides and goodness knows what else, but they're not pushing buttons on screens to make things happen on screen. They're very much you interacting with the real world. So it's sort of horses for it's a very complicated question you ask, because the way we use digital and do new things depends a bit on the environment of what we're trying to do, which is a very boring answer, I know.
What comes next for you, your personal moonshot, if any, and paint a picture of a world you want to see by 2030.
I've got one book finished out next March, The Virtual You, and I hope that does well. And I've got another book on the go where we've acquired Stephen Hawking's office, so I'm writing up the objects in his office, which go from Simpsons action figures to pictures with presidents and beach balls and all sorts of interesting bits and pieces. So that it's not exactly a moonshot, but it's something that this is more like a Virgin Galactic trip to near Earth. But I'm looking forward to getting that out of the way. I think the main thing, like anyone, is I do hope. In fact, we're working on I'm winding back. A gallery about the energy revolution. What I'm hoping is that, these rather alarming signs of climate change around the planet, we just had a very hot summer, we've seen droughts, we've seen floods and displacements of millions of people, and we think the climate crisis is beginning. So I think my sincere hope is that we do get to a very low carbon global economy in the next decade. Otherwise, I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And also that we respect the planetary ecosystems a bit more, because they're our kind of life support systems. And if you look at the statistics in terms of species extinctions and so on, it's really pretty alarming at the moment. So I think that would be my dream. That's probably my moonshot as well. I want to be in a nice planet to live in. We've had a very strange October in the UK, very, very warm. Didn't feel like a normal October at all, which I think a lot of us are being a bit unsettled by. If you're in a hotter country, obviously the implications can be quite profound. So there we are. It's not a very original message, but it is a heartfelt message.
It's so, the message itself is so important, because I think you rightfully pointed out, we're living in a world which is drastically changing because of the climate and because of our overconsumption without any conservation. And I hope the governments, the nations, the big tech, instead of having these fancy and far out visions of 2070 going zero emission or 2050 going zero emission, I hope they are more realistic, more pragmatic, and start taking constructive approach of going to a zero emission soon. Because yes, you pointed out, I think at least here in India, the reason I kind of moved, I was based out of Bombay all my life, and I recently moved because I've got a 7-year-old boy who's got a wheezing problem, and that's because of the pollution of the city, and that's across India. Just last week I was in Delhi and stepped out of the plane, was completely hazy, and the weather is going bonkers. The rains are no longer the way it was, everything. So I hope we are a little cognizant about the changing nature or the dynamics of the climate, and start seriously, constructively, doing things, where we can reverse the global climate impact. And I really hope that. So thank you for taking part and being part of the podcast. It was really insightful. We wish you the very best. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Thank you, Roger. Really appreciate this.
Pleasure. Been great fun. Thank you.